By the time the Dogs arrived in Jacksonville on Halloween 2015, everything was in place for them to have the ability to go on to play for the SEC championship game. All they had to do was beat Florida, a not great Florida team, a number 11 team in the country, but a Florida team that had seen its ups and downs that season already. They had lost to LSU. They had beaten Ole Miss, a number 3 Ole Miss team, but they looked not good against Tennessee. They won the game. They looked not good against Kentucky. They looked not good against East Carolina, and everything was on the line for the Dogs. And Georgia had lost after Tennessee came back on them at Neyland in 2015. Alabama had romped them in Athens, but it was all on the line. They could win that game, win the rest of their games, which they turned out to do, go 10-2 and face Alabama again in the SEC championship game. None of that happened, and that's when everything changed at Georgia. And I was looking at something. I can't remember what made me think of this topic, but I think I as a person who's been around since the beginning of Mark Richt's time at Georgia, and I was a student at Georgia before that even. I think it's really important to go back to how we got to where we are today. And how we got to where we are today is that game specifically was it's over. So in the behind the scenes of things, the staff at Georgia still felt like they could save their job after the Florida game. It wasn't the Alabama game that cost Mark Richt his job at Georgia. And it was, I would say, probably not the Tennessee game, but those two led to the situation, which was it's on the line against the Gators, and you're either going to do it or you're not. And they decided to go with Fatone Balta. So I actually could argue. I think it's a legitimate argument to say that Kirby Smart was going to be hired at Georgia as soon as Mark hired Brian Schottenheimer. That was a disastrous decision. I mean, Jeremy Pruitt was bad enough. But that night, and I know this is sort of seen as a negative video, but I think it's important to remember that night, Fatone Balta was swimming upstream with, weights all over his body. He could not do it. And that was the decision that was made. And I think the decision was made. I don't know when the decision was made in the grand scheme of things. I remember very well a loss to Alabama did not cost Mark his job, and therefore elevated Kirby. I do remember a very quick story from that game. I was on the field not necessarily where I always am before the game, but I just sort of circumstantially was on the visitor sideline. Actually, I am on the visitor sideline a lot pregame, and now that I think of it. And Alabama came running out, and the Georgia players at the time warmed up on the closed end zone or the non-bridge end zone. So the visitor, they now warm up there because they come out of that. That's where they come out of. They come out of the same entrance for the last 40, 50 years, whatever it's been. But they used to warm up on the opposite end. So they ran right past Georgia's players. And there was a lot of jawing and barking. And, Alabama was there to play the game. Georgia was there to talk about it before the game. And that's when I knew they are not winning this game. This is not happening. I didn't think it would be a 4-touchdown loss necessarily. Because the last time they had played one another, it had been a real knife fight in Atlanta. And I remember Kirby saying to Keelan Johnson, who had played at Georgia in 2005 when Kirby was there, why, it's like, what's going on here? Basically, was what Keelan said to him. And Kirby was like, we don't care. And that was the attitude that was about to come to Georgia. Was a very different attitude. They weren't worried about who was warming up where and all this stuff. They were just there to win football games. The only time I can recall in the Kirby Smart era that Georgia players have pregame mixed it up, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but was definitely the Missouri game in 2022. They nearly lost that game. Besides that, I don't remember, and again, this is the part where someone can correct me, I don't recall anybody from that point forward, or before or after that, sort of in pregame shenanigans. It is important to remember how far this program's come, because that's almost 10 years ago now. And again, I don't know why I feel like I always have to say this, but Mark Richt was a superb head coach. He was excellent. He was better than Gene Chizik, Larry Coker, Ed Orgeron. The difference between those three and Mark, besides Mark's longevity, is they won a national championship because of a spectacular player, or a spectacular quarterback, or but they weren't better coaches at the end of the day. But what Kirby did at Georgia was he changed everything in terms of the football program. But I think what Kirby needs to get the biggest credit for, as someone who advocated this for a long time, and I advocate for it in Georgia basketball, Georgia baseball, but I've been harshest on Georgia basketball because I've lived in that world, AAU world, college basketball world, is this, even the sky is not the limit for what Georgia as an institution can do. And I think that it should consistently be in the top 10 in the Sears Cup standings. That didn't happen this year. That's a problem. Like, that's not a massive problem, but it's a problem. So why did that happen? What can be done to make that better? Kirby, I think, sort of, this is the wrong way to put it, but I don't know any other way to put it. She kind of shook the baby enough to like, hey, let's go. Like, we need these things to take advantage of what is already here. LSU is great at getting its own way. Florida has perfected it. Georgia was really good at it for a long time. That's not the case anymore in football. I can tell you that right now. And it was that night in Jacksonville. Mark that was his biggest struggle, was beating Florida. Kirby's lost to him twice. Year one in 2020, and that's it. And they've not all been blowouts, to be clear. In Florida in 21, I'm often reminded of the 21 season when I just flipped through books. But Florida, that game was close with Georgia going, deep into the second quarter. And then Georgia just took over. The defense just took over. N'Kobe Dean, Nolan Smith, and he's, Kirby's sitting there screaming, physically, I want to break them. And there was another word in there that I won't repeat. But I don't know if it took that night in Jacksonville in 2015. The program had really devolved. Jeremy Pruitt was a real problem in terms of, I think he thought it was the head coach, which is a real problem on a lot of levels. But that's when things changed. It wasn't, Kirby being hired, of course, but what led to him being hired? Greg McGarity came very narrowly fired Mark after the 14th season. The coaching staff in 14 was concerned that if they didn't win the Belk Bowl, that they would be terminated. And, the coaching staff a year later, not even a year later, thought that if they close out the season with wins against Auburn, Georgia Southern, and Georgia Tech, that they would go on to be retained. They were not going to be retained. In fact, I was told walking off the field against Georgia Southern that if that had happened, Mark would have been let go the next day. I don't think that was speculation, actually, from the person who told me that. So it was a turbulent time at Georgia, and I think it was the worst season this century, and that's saying something, because the year 2000 was a massive disappointment for Georgia. The year 2009, 2010, those were both really those were tough seasons for the Dogs. But when things changed was as a result of that game and that result. I don't know when the final decision was made, but it wasn't made much after Florida, and it could have been made before that. But I don't think Georgia being beaten by Alabama was at home. I don't think it was that. Now, I did say after the Tennessee game, this is how your ass gets fired. So I need to do a little bit more digging. You know, I remember at the time, you know, nobody was saying anything in terms of how this happened, when did this happen, you know, da, 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 da. But, you know, Greg was not talking to reporters, said he had to think about it after the Georgia Tech game. There wasn't anything to think about. You know, the decision had been made. You don't think about it and then 24 hours later, not even 24 hours later, let Mark go. I mean, Greg knew what he was going to do. He's never said that to me, but that's certainly my suspicion. And, you know, I remember where I was when that happened. I knew immediately it would be Kirby. I don't think anybody was confused about that. And the rest is history, as they say. But that was the moment where things changed. It was a bad one. And teams like Florida, you know, Tennessee, I guess LSU, your ascent to the top starts at the bottom, or your bottom. And you know, we're just going to see how far this goes. But I say all that. I love Mark Richt. I'm appreciative of everything Mark did at Georgia. I think that you know, for Kirby, the road in front of him is still an important one, and it's one where if I think he does need to win more national championships, or he's not fulfilling his potential, because he has the potential to be one of, if not the best college football coach of all time. And for people who are triggered by that, you know, I don't know what to tell you, but he's got to do certain things still for that to happen. But anyway, thanks for watching. That was a tough night. I tell you right now, the Georgia folks were not pleased.